remember the day I handed her the keys like it was yesterday. The sunlight streamed through the living room windows, catching the dust motes and making the space feel alive, almost magical, even though it was empty. I had worked years for this moment, scraping, saving, and planning, all to give her something no one could ever take away, her own home. I watched her fingers curl around the small metal keys, the weight of them seeming heavier than anything I'd ever carried. She looked at me with that familiar mix of gratitude and cautious hope, the way she always did when life had knocked her down, but she refused to stay there. My chest swelled with pride, thinking of the long nights she stayed up studying, the jobs she worked to pay for school, the times she held back tears so no one else would worry. This house was hers, fully hers, a symbol of freedom, independence, and all she deserved. Yet, as she stared at the keys, there was a flicker in her eyes I hadn't seen before, a shadow of worry that pulled at my gut. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the weight of responsibility settling in, but something in her posture whispered caution, a quiet tension beneath her forced smile. I asked if she was okay, and she nodded, though her fingers trembled ever so slightly, betraying the calm she tried to show. I had always wanted her to feel secure, to have a place where she could breathe and dream without fear, and yet as we lingered in that empty hallway, I couldn't shake the unease creeping into the edges of my mind. My own memories of being powerless in the face of unfairness flickered briefly, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, this gift, this symbol of all we had worked for, might bring unexpected complications. She shifted her weight, avoiding my gaze for a moment, then smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed distant, a silent story behind them I didn't yet understand. And in that instant, as I stood there, feeling both triumph and a quiet apprehension, I knew that this moment was only the beginning of a journey neither of us could yet see. A journey where love and fear would collide, and the house that should have been a sanctuary might reveal secrets we were unprepared for. Her hand tightened slightly around the keys, and I held my breath, wondering if I had done enough to protect her from the world, and from those who might try to claim her happiness for themselves. I walked up the driveway, humming a quiet tune to myself, imagining the smile that would greet me when I saw her enjoying her new home. But the moment I stepped inside, the sound of her sobs hit me like a physical blow. She was sitting on the living room floor, knees pulled up to her chest, shoulders shaking, and tears streaming freely down her face. My heart lurched. "What happened?" I asked, dropping the boxes I'd carried, my voice tight with concern. She couldn't speak at first, just shook her head, and the emptiness of the house felt suddenly wrong, foreign. Furniture was out of place, dishes cluttered the counters, and unfamiliar blankets and shoes were scattered across the floor. My stomach twisted as I scanned the room, spotting a pair of leather shoes I didn't recognize near the doorway, a half-empty water bottle on the coffee table that wasn't hers, and mail addressed to someone else. I froze, disbelief washing over me. How could anyone have walked into this house, my gift, and made it theirs without permission? My blood boiled. I felt a surge of anger and protective instinct, every parent's worst nightmare igniting inside me. I knelt beside her, brushing the damp strands of hair from her face, trying to catch her gaze, desperate for an explanation. She finally whispered, They just moved in." The words barely registered at first, like a punch to the gut, until I took a step back, letting my eyes roam the room again. Evidence of intrusion was everywhere. Clothes on the sofa that didn't belong to her, a backpack tucked under the dining table, and a faint smell of someone else's perfume lingering in the air. My mind raced. Who had the audacity to do this? My daughter's pain became my own, and I felt a surge of resolve, a burning need to protect what was rightfully hers. Every instinct told me to act immediately, to confront whoever had the nerve to invade her life like this. But I forced myself to pause, to observe and gather the truth before taking the first step. The quiet sobs continued, and I held her hand tightly, whispering promises I intended to keep, even if the world had turned against us for now. My pulse pounded in my ears as the realization sank in. This was not a minor mistake, a misunderstanding, or bad timing. Someone had deliberately crossed a line, and I could feel the weight of the battle that lay ahead. I finally managed to steady my breathing and called out, "Who's here?" Show yourselves." The silence was heavy for a moment. Then a door creaked open, and two unfamiliar faces stepped into the room. Their smug expressions immediately set my teeth on edge. We're staying," the woman said, her tone oddly casual, as if this were perfectly normal. I blinked, my mind struggling to process her words. "Excuse me?" I asked, voice tight, trying to keep the fury from spilling over. "You can't just move into my daughter's house," I said, gesturing toward the living room strewn with their belongings. She crossed her arms, smirking. "We have an arrangement." She agreed. "She said you wouldn't mind." I turned sharply to my daughter. She looked at me, tears still brimming, shoulders slumped. I didn't know they'd move in," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't want this," she added, the words almost swallowed by her sobs. My blood boiled. "She didn't know?" I snapped at them, fury lacing my voice. "You came here under false pretenses. You lied. You manipulated her." The man shifted uncomfortably but tried to maintain his composure. "We just thought it would be easier if she had company. You know, family support." My daughter's lips trembled as she shook her head violently. "No, I never asked for this. They've been controlling me, threatening me, making me feel like I'm nothing." The room went silent for a heartbeat, their smug confidence faltering under the weight of her words. I stepped closer to her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "You don't deserve this," I said firmly, staring the intruders down. "This is her house, her space, her life, and no one gets to take that from her." The air felt charged, heavy with tension. I could feel her fear, helplessness, and the deep injustice that had been forced upon her. My heart ached for her, but underneath that ache was a growing resolve. They had overstepped, and I would not let them succeed. Every instinct screamed that the next steps had to be precise, deliberate, and decisive. I wasn't just standing up for a house. I was standing up for her dignity, for the life she had earned through struggle and sacrifice. And I wouldn't rest until she felt safe and vindicated again. As I held her trembling hand, memories of the past weeks flickered through my mind like a stormy slideshow. I remembered the calls she had tried to hide from me, the subtle hesitations in her voice whenever she mentioned her in-laws. She had confided once, late at night over the phone, about how they pressured her to let them help with the house, how their compliments were always laced with expectations, how every offer of assistance came with a quiet threat if she disagreed. I could see now how expertly they had twisted her kindness into submission, her desire for peace into fear. I remembered her tears over canceled plans, harsh comments about her supposed inadequacy, and the way she had begun doubting herself for wanting a life independent of their control. My chest tightened, but alongside the anger and disbelief rose a surge of pride. Despite their manipulation, she had endured, continued working, continued dreaming, continued fighting for a place that was rightfully hers. She was strong, resilient, and yet this betrayal still shook her to the core. I looked at her now, curled in the corner, and felt both heartbreak and admiration. And then the woman stepped forward, her tone suddenly cold and clipped, as if rehearsed for maximum effect. "You should know," she said, eyes hard. "If you interfere, we won't hesitate to call the police. You can't just take the law into your own hands." My jaw tightened. The audacity, the entitlement, it was staggering. For a moment, fear threatened to creep in, but I shook it off, knowing the truth of her struggle and the strength she had built over the years. They wanted me intimidated, but I refused to let their threats dictate our reality. The room seemed to shrink with tension, the air thick with unspoken challenges, and I realized that this confrontation was only the beginning. How far were they willing to go, and how far would I need to go to reclaim what was hers? I sank into the armchair, running a hand over my face, and felt a heaviness I hadn't experienced in years. Watching her curled on the floor, shoulders shaking, I realized just how powerless I felt in that moment. Money, influence, years of experience, all of it meant nothing when faced with the audacity of people who believed they could walk into our lives and take what was ours. My daughter's sobs echoed in the empty rooms, each one stabbing at my chest, reminding me how fragile her hope had become. The in-laws lounged confidently across the living room, their smug expressions a sharp contrast to my daughter's trembling form. It was infuriating, me, A man who had built businesses, protected families, and navigated life's hardest challenges, reduced to watching helplessly as these opportunists asserted dominance over my own daughter. And yet, as despair threatened to swallow me, a flicker of resolve began to spark. I could feel the gears turning in my mind, a quiet tactical awareness surfacing beneath the anger and pain. Perhaps brute force wasn't the answer. Perhaps patience, observation, and strategy would serve better. I leaned back, studying their every movement, noticing patterns, small habits, vulnerabilities they didn't even realize they were revealing. My daughter's trembling hand brushed against mine, and I squeezed it gently, whispering words of reassurance I wasn't even sure I believed yet. But inside, beneath the helplessness, a seed of plan had been planted. I would not let them win. Not now, not ever. And somewhere in that quiet, somber room, the first glimmer of our comeback began to form, fragile but unstoppable. I left the house that night with my head full of plans and my hands empty of immediate answers. I'd built my life on knowing people, reading situations, and using quiet leverage rather than theatrics, and suddenly all those instincts came roaring back. As we drove home, I listened to her talk in fits and starts about small humiliations she had accepted for the sake of peace. How they'd slowly tightened control by offering help, by sowing doubt, by claiming moral authority over decisions that weren't theirs. Each detail she gave was a thread I could follow, and I began to see the pattern: manipulate, isolate, and then normalize the takeover. That night, I opened a notebook and started writing like I used to in quieter, more ruthless days. Step 1, gather evidence. Photos of their belongings inside the house, receipts, messages, anything that showed this wasn't a casual visit. Step 2, legal groundwork. I didn't want a jailbreak, but I knew enough lawyers and had enough sense to begin a paper trail. Ownership documents, proof of purchase, a registered deed, proof of my daughter's residency intent. Step 3, social pressure. These people thrived on boldness. The plan was to make subtle, unavoidable pressure feel inevitable and embarrassing. I called an old friend from the law firm I'd once used for corporate disputes. I didn't want to involve heavy legal muscle immediately. The point was to rattle them with precise, measured pressure. He agreed to look over the documents and draft a sternly worded letter demanding they vacate while we sought amicable resolution, one that would also make clear we were prepared to escalate. Then I reached out to a neighbor I knew owned a small local bakery, someone who disliked drama and valued fairness. I asked them to casually note the unusual comings and goings. Community whispers, I knew, could be a force of their own. Next, I thought about timing and optics. They had acted brazenly because they assumed I would respond brazenly, which would play into their narrative of interfering father. So I planned the opposite: calm, invisible pressure. Notices taped to doors, polite but official letters, friendly inquiries that felt routine but were calculated. I intended to make the house feel less like a place they'd taken and more like a spotlight that could shine on every one of their choices. The reversal would not be a sudden public spectacle, but a tightening coil that left them scrambling. As I mapped this out, I found myself smiling in a way that was both tired and satisfied. The idea of turning their confidence into unease felt almost delicious. My daughter watched me quietly, the first real spark of hope returning to her eyes. She asked in a small voice, "What will you do first?" I answered simply, "We document everything. We don't give them the drama they want. We make the truth unavoidable." She nodded, grip tightening on my hand, relief and apprehension mingling on her face. In the back of my mind, a darker strategy lingered, one that involved exposing their greed to the extended family, and if necessary to the authorities. But I kept that file closed for now, reserving it like an ace up my sleeve. Let them believe they had leverage. Let them sink further into complacency. Then, when the time was right, we would flip the table. "They won't know what hit them," I told her, half to reassure her and half to steady myself. The plan felt elegant in its simplicity and dangerously effective in its restraint. I would not fight fire with fire. I would smother the blaze with methodical pressure and allies who owed me nothing but the truth. As we prepared to sleep that night, the house no longer felt entirely lost. It felt like a chessboard where, finally, I could see several moves ahead. We would watch, collect, and wait, patient, precise, and utterly determined to return that home to her and to her alone. No mercy. The next morning, I returned to the house with calm determination, carrying nothing but the evidence I had gathered and the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the art of patience. I walked through the rooms, taking note of their belongings, photographing what was clearly not hers, and arranging the documents that would make their deception impossible to ignore. I didn't confront them immediately. I let the subtle shifts in ownership speak first. A carefully placed letter slid under the door, a friendly neighbor casually asking questions about unusual activity, small legal notices sent via certified mail. Each move was deliberate, a whisper of authority that hinted at a force they had overlooked. By mid-afternoon, the change in the air was palpable. They began to glance around nervously, muttering among themselves as they noticed how organized and precise my actions were. The casual confidence they had worn like armor started to crack. "Did he hire someone?" the woman whispered to her husband, eyes wide with uncertainty. They hadn't realized I was playing chess while they had been moving pawns. My daughter watched from the couch, her shoulders still tight, but her face lifting slightly as hope returned. She whispered, "He's doing something. I feel it. I feel like this is finally changing." And indeed it was. I could see them recalculating their approach, the first real hint that their control was slipping. When I finally spoke, it was in a calm, measured tone, emphasizing facts rather than threats. "These are her belongings, her space, her life. I'm just making sure the house reflects that." The look of disbelief on their faces was almost delicious. They had underestimated me entirely, assuming wealth alone would be irrelevant, that a father's pride could be dismissed. It was a subtle victory, but a victory nonetheless. My daughter's eyes met mine, gratitude and relief flickering alongside lingering fear. I could feel her hope growing with each careful, quiet step I took. And as I left that evening, I knew the message had been received. I was not helpless, and our reclaiming had begun. The balance of power had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but enough to send the first tremors of doubt through those who had once believed they controlled everything. Section 8. Secrets Unearthed. I spent the next few days digging quietly, retracing their steps, listening to hushed conversations, and piecing together the puzzle they had so carefully hidden. Late at night, I went through old messages my daughter had reluctantly saved, emails she hadn't meant to keep, and photographs she had tucked away. Patterns emerged quickly, tiny mentions of inheritances, casual boasts about future profits, subtle boasts of entitlement. It became clear they hadn't just moved in for convenience or family bonding. They had been calculating, methodical, motivated by nothing less than financial gain and a claim on assets that were never theirs to touch. I remembered my daughter's whispered complaints about being pressured to help with their bills, to co-sign minor purchases, each framed as casual guidance but subtly coercive. And then the bigger picture came into focus. The house, once a symbol of her independence, had become a pawn in their plan to entangle her financially, to assert dominance, and to push her toward surrender. Their scheme wasn't about kindness, it was about leverage. My pulse quickened with a mix of outrage and grim satisfaction. The more I uncovered, the more I realized the advantage had shifted. I began documenting everything meticulously. Screenshots, receipts, timestamps, phone logs. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall of accountability I was building, one that would make their lies undeniable. I also reached out discreetly to a few trusted contacts, allies who could corroborate what I was finding, each one a silent reinforcement of the moral and psychological upper hand I was gaining. As the evidence piled up, I felt the first true surge of control since this nightmare began. They thought they could manipulate us through intimidation, charm, and assumed authority. They had misjudged my patience, my experience, and my resolve. Now, armed with proof and clarity, I could craft a strategy that was not only legally sound but morally undeniable. By the time I put the documents together, the plan was taking shape in my mind like a chessboard. Every move they had made could be countered, exposed, and reversed. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The house, the inheritance, the sense of justice. It was all within reach, and they would not see it coming. I returned to the house the following evening, a folder of carefully compiled evidence in my hand, feeling a calm resolve settle over me. I didn't storm in or shout. I had learned that subtlety carried more weight than fury. The in-laws were lounging in the living room, unaware that the tide was about to turn. I cleared my throat and their heads snapped toward me, eyes narrowing in suspicion. "I think it's time we discuss the reality of the situation," I said evenly, placing the folder on the coffee table. They leaned forward, curiosity mixed with arrogance. I opened it slowly, letting them see every document, every message, every photograph that proved their scheme. Their expressions shifted from casual confidence to disbelief, and finally, to unease. I spoke carefully, outlining the evidence, each point precise and undeniable. I emphasized facts over emotion, leaving them no room for excuses. "These are your actions," I said, watching their faces. "And these are the consequences you can't avoid if this continues." My daughter sat beside me, straightening her posture for the first time in weeks. I could see a spark of confidence returning to her eyes. The knowledge that her father was in control, that she wasn't alone, and that justice could be reclaimed. The in-laws murmured, trying to regain composure, but I could tell the balance had shifted. They realized I had anticipated their every move, predicted their manipulations, and gathered proof strong enough to expose them fully. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching as they considered their options. Then, just as a flicker of relief crossed my daughter's face, the woman's tone hardened, sharp and deliberate. "You may have some proof," she said, voice cold. "But if you push this further, we won't hesitate to retaliate publicly. You think your little plan protects her, but don't forget, we can make this messy. Very messy." The words landed like a stone in the room, a direct threat, and I felt the weight of the next move pressing down. I glanced at my daughter, who straightened her shoulders and met my gaze, the first real fire of determination flickering in her eyes. The confrontation had shifted the battlefield, and now the stakes were higher than ever. I knew we weren't done. The game had only escalated. The day of reckoning arrived with a tension that made the air in the house almost impossible to breathe. I had carefully orchestrated a meeting, inviting a few key witnesses, our lawyer, a couple of trusted neighbors, and the extended family who had long turned blind eyes to the subtle cruelty the in-laws had inflicted. I made sure it appeared casual, an attempt at mediation, but every detail was strategically planned. I watched from the doorway as the in-laws arrived, their confident smirks masking barely concealed apprehension. They had no idea the trap had been set with precision and patience. I began calmly, introducing each piece of evidence, presenting it factually, methodically, and publicly. Screenshots, emails, receipts, photographs, every manipulated interaction they had forced upon my daughter was now undeniable. I narrated the story as if I were simply telling the truth, letting the documents speak louder than any angry words I could have hurled. The in-laws shifted uncomfortably, their composure cracking with every revelation. Murmurs rose among the neighbors and family members as they realized the full extent of the deceit, and the first whispers of doubt began to ripple through the room. The moment that tipped the scales came when I stood and pointed out their scheme in plain terms. How they had used my daughter's trust to occupy her home, manipulate her financial decisions, and assert control over her life, all while pretending to be benevolent. Their smirks faltered, hands clutched at pockets, at purses, at invisible defenses. My daughter, sitting beside me, held her head high for the first time in weeks. I could feel her pride returning as she watched the same people who had terrified her crumble under scrutiny. Then came the kicker, the financial leverage. I casually mentioned the legal rights and consequences they had ignored, the fines and potential civil liabilities if they didn't vacate immediately. Their eyes widened as they realized the severity of their position, the public humiliation compounded by the knowledge that every neighbor and family member now knew the truth. The social power they had relied on dissolved in front of everyone, replaced by admiration for the composure and clever strategy my daughter and I had executed. Finally, the in-laws sputtered, trying to defend themselves, but every word only deepened the embarrassment. I let them speak, calmly allowing their arguments to be self-defeating, their attempts at dominance now a public display of their greed and incompetence. I could see the shame in their faces, the realization that their plan had completely backfired. By the end of the confrontation, the room had shifted entirely. The extended family looked at my daughter with newfound respect, neighbors nodded in quiet acknowledgement, and the lawyer discreetly confirmed that all the documentation was now on record, giving her full protection. My daughter's smile, tentative at first, became genuine as she leaned into me, whispering, "Thank you. I feel safe again." And in that moment, the weight of weeks of fear, humiliation, and manipulation lifted. The karmic payoff was complete. Those who had tried to claim what wasn't theirs were exposed, humiliated, and powerless, while my daughter reclaimed her life, her home, and her dignity. Every ounce of patience, every calculated move, every strategic decision had led to this triumph, a victory that was both emotional and irrefutable, leaving no doubt about who held the true power. After the in-laws had been removed and the house returned fully to her, the change in my daughter was immediate and profound. The weight that had been pressing on her shoulders for weeks lifted almost visibly, and she moved through the rooms with a lightness I hadn't seen since she was a child. I watched her place her belongings back where she wanted them, rearranging furniture, opening drawers, and filling the house with her presence rather than someone else's shadow. Her smile, tentative at first, grew brighter with each step, a reflection of her regained independence and control. We sat together in the living room later, the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside our windows. She leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder. And for a while, we said nothing, just letting the silence affirm that we had endured and overcome. I could feel her breathing even out, her heartbeat slowing, as though the tension of the past weeks was dissolving. We talked then about family, about loyalty, trust, and the quiet strength it takes to protect what matters most. She admitted how powerless she had felt, how the in-laws had made her question her own judgment, and how alone she thought she was. I reminded her of the resilience she had shown, the courage in facing manipulation, and the intelligence with which she had allowed me to guide the reclaiming of her home. Together, we reflected on the contrast, the despair and helplessness she had endured compared to the empowerment and confidence she now possessed. Each moment of regained authority, every clever maneuver I had made on her behalf, had transformed not just the house but her sense of self. By the end of our conversation, she was laughing softly at memories of the in-laws' frantic attempts to maintain control, and I felt the satisfaction of seeing justice realized, not only in the material sense but in the emotional reclaiming of her space and dignity. We shared stories, reassured each other, and allowed the bond between father and daughter to deepen, strengthened by the trials we had endured together. The house was no longer just walls and a roof. It was a testament to her resilience, our loyalty, and the truth that even when family fails, love, strategy, and patience can restore what was nearly lost. Sitting alone in the quiet of the house that night, I let the events of the past week settle around me like a weight finally released. I reflected on everything that had happened, the deception, the manipulation, the fear, and the moments of helplessness, and realized how much I had learned about vigilance, justice, and the depth of love for my daughter. Justice wasn't just about winning. It was about observing, understanding, and acting with precision. I had seen firsthand how easily trust could be exploited, and how patience and strategy could turn the tide in ways that brute force never could. I thought about her courage, the way she had endured weeks of manipulation yet never surrendered completely, and I felt an immense pride swell within me. Love, I realized, was more than protection. It was guidance, support, and the unwavering commitment to help someone reclaim their life without stripping them of their agency. These lessons were hard-earned but necessary, shaping not only how I approached this battle but how I would guard against future threats. And yet, as I turned off the lights and walked through the empty rooms, a small, uneasy thought lingered in the back of my mind. While the in-laws had been forced out, I knew their pride and greed were not easily quelled. Small gestures, offhand comments, or future schemes could still surface, subtle enough to test our resolve, but never strong enough to truly harm us again. That thought was a reminder that life was never entirely predictable, that vigilance had to be constant, and that even victory carried echoes of potential challenges ahead. I allowed a quiet smile to settle over me, knowing we had won the battle that mattered most. The house, Her independence and our bond were intact, but life, as always, held surprises. And if the in-laws ever tried to reemerge in some small, cunning way, I knew we would be ready, stronger, wiser, and united. The night felt peaceful, but beneath that peace lingered the faint hum of watchfulness, a subtle tension that promised our story wasn't completely over, leaving room for whatever future challenges might come. Weeks later, I watched my daughter move through the house with a confidence that had been absent for far too long. She prepared meals in the kitchen, organized her workspace, and even hosted a small gathering of friends who had supported her quietly from afar. Every action, every decision she made, was infused with independence, a clear contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had once shadowed her every step. I felt a deep satisfaction settle in my chest, knowing that the trials we had endured had forged her strength rather than breaking it. Yet beneath that pride, I remained wary. The in-laws' audacity had reminded me that vigilance was necessary, that not every threat announces itself openly, and that some challenges might reappear when least expected. But this wariness was tempered by confidence, the knowledge that she now had the tools, courage, and support to face whatever came next. Our bond, tested and strengthened through weeks of betrayal and calculated strategy, had emerged unshakable, a foundation on which her future could be built. I lingered in the hallway as she laughed with friends in the living room, her voice light and unguarded. It was a sound that had been absent for too long, a signal that the house truly belonged to her, and that no one could claim it without consequence. I thought about the in-laws, their plans unraveled, their schemes exposed, and felt the full measure of karmic satisfaction. Justice had been served quietly but undeniably, and the emotional scars had transformed into lessons of resilience and empowerment. And in that moment, as I watched her navigate her reclaimed space with joy and confidence, the truth settled in me completely. This was her life, her triumph, her independence, and it was untouchable. She finally owns her life, and no one can take it from her.